someday to get this good.
On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the story of a Chinese-owned factory in heartland America. And the new development bank doubles down on development projects. We speak to their CFO to see how the NDB stands out from the established banks. And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin today's show with an American documentary film which has incited a debate both inside and outside the U.S. American Factory, it is called, the first film from former U.S. first couple Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's Higher Ground Productions, premiered last week on Netflix. It tells the story of Chinese company Fuyao's factory in the U.S. state of Ohio. Before we ask our panelists, what exactly is this movie trying to tell us, and how do they see the stories within it? Take a look at this introduction of the movie first.
American Factory steams ahead in the U.S. heartland. A multi-year collaboration between Obama's Higher Ground and Netflix, telling a story of what happened when a Chinese company took over an abandoned General Motors plant. Directed by Academy Award-nominated filmmakers Stephen Bognar and Julia Reichart, the documentary examines the lives of blue-collar workers in Dayton, Ohio, who were laid off from their auto jobs in the 2008 recession. Some of whom were hired 6 years later by Fuyao, a Chinese manufacturer of automotive glass. 2,000 Buckeyes are hired to work shoulder to shoulder with experienced Chinese employees. Early days of hope and optimism give way to setbacks as executive China clashes with working-class America. Both the factory and employees are adapting. In the film, a Fuyao executive said, "We are melding two different cultures, the Chinese and the American." Former U.S. President Barack Obama tweeted, "A good story gives you the chance to better understand someone else's life. It can help you find common ground, and it's why Michelle and I were drawn to Higher Ground's first film." This film started shooting in 2015, when the then U.S. administration encouraged Chinese companies to enter the American market. However, things have changed a lot in the past few years. Now American Factory has debuted amid the year-long China-U.S. trade war.
So what does the film American Factory, the documentary film, reveal about the investment between China and the United States, and also the interactions and differences as well as similarities between the two peoples? Let's loop in our panelists. For now, we are joined by Arthur Dong, professor of Georgetown University's McDonald School of Business. Professor, help us to understand, you have watched the movie, I would assume.
Yes, I have.
What do you make of it?
Yes, the film, I think, is a beautifully made film in terms of a wonderful piece of documentary filmmaking that sort of captures it's a story of both death and resurrection. On the one hand, we see a dying automotive plant that has been abandoned by General Motors, a source of employment and livelihood for this town for many generations. And then as a result of this, a Chinese company in a very unlikely situation coming to this town in Dayton, Ohio, making hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to revive the fortunes of this factory and to create employment for American workers.
Professor Dong, one of the things very important to bear in mind is the timing of the movie. When it was begin shooting, it was actually the time when the Obama administration was encouraging Chinese investment into America to create jobs and opportunities. Now we are at a very different stage. If you look at the recent history, the trade war going on between China and the United States, and certainly Chinese investment were being kicked out of the U.S. as a result of various changes of policies and attitudes. So when you look at that movie now, in retrospect, what do you make of the dramatic change taking place just over the past 5 years or so?
Yes, I think the movie itself is a stunning piece of of information with regard to the current narrative that the Trump administration is portraying, that trade with China is a one-way street. As we could see clearly, as demonstrated in this film, that when Chinese companies make investments in the United States, those investments do lead to economic value and also wind up benefiting Americans and American society in many significant ways. And so I think one of the things that has been discussed is whether or not Chinese companies would be able to engage more actively in the U.S. economy. And of course, many Chinese companies have, over the past dozen years or so, have expressed strong interest in terms of, finding ways to invest in America. But as a result of policy, oftentimes they are met with a cold shoulder.
Yes, indeed. And now we are also joined by Madeline Janis, who is the Executive Director of the Strategic Policy Center Jobs to Move America. Ms. Janis, welcome to our program. I understand you're joining us through the phone. Tell me about your understanding of this film. I understand you've also been writing some of the commentaries in some of the publications in the U.S. You've been talking about the jobs and creation as well as taking away of jobs as a result of the changes. What do you make of the story?
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. It's a beautifully told story, and it really is a quintessentially American story. In other words, in my view, the way that Fuyao treats its workers and really acts toward the city of Dayton and toward American workers is very, very similar in not a good way to the way that European companies act, the way that American companies act, which is to really start to see these workers as less than human, as not deserving of the rights to be represented by union, the rights to have a safe working conditions, to make a living wage. And so you see the story unfold, and you see really an American story. And I think the title is apt, American Factory. And what I've been writing about is that Chinese owners are just as varied and different as American owners are. And so the Fuyao company treats its workers badly and really works hard to target and fire people who are standing up for their rights. But we've dealt with other Chinese companies who have treated their workers well in the United States. And so, and we've dealt with American companies who treat their workers badly. So for me and for us, this is really an incredible insight into what happens in the United States when workers try to stand up for themselves and really to be treated as, as human beings.
Very interesting, your observation, Ms. Janis. I mean, one of the things people have been talking about is the different ways of governance in the enterprises, and also how workers are being rallied to work and what their work ethics compared to so-called the labor rights protection as well as the cultural differences. What do you make of this mixture of various factors, being reflected in one factory over there when the U.S. is trying to call upon international investors to come into the United States and try to create jobs for the American workers?
In some ways, I think that's kind of a false comparison. Honestly, I think that, yes, it looks in the film as though the Chinese work ethic is work harder and the American work ethic is work less and even be lazy. But in truth, some of the Chinese workers also struggle with overwork and not being able to spend time with their families. And I think that the same situation plays out in American factories or Canadian-owned factories, where workers are forced to work mandatory overtime. They don't have time with their families. They have to work so hard they get sick. And for us, that is really the essence. Wherever people work, they should have a decent life.
Right.
People should work hard. We want people to work hard, but also people are people.
This is exactly some of the debates going on inside that factory, beautifully captured by the storytellers and the producers. That is, they even eventually have a vote among all the factory workers as to whether they want a union factory or they do not want a union factory. And the latter won with most of the majority of the votes. It's a very interesting situation over there. On the one hand, that people want to have less work pressure and less, shall I say, workload. But on the other hand, they do not want to have a life in which they do not have a job to support their family. So it really gives us interesting comparison, Professor Dong. When you look at that very complex situation. This is really the globalization 2.0 that we're talking about, the dilemma of globalization and the dilemma of supply chains, the dilemma of factories and workers, as well as their local communities that have to face the latest development, Professor.
Yes, Tian. Companies like Fuyao Glass, as well as General Motors, are not immune from the competitive forces of a global economy. Just as General Motors had an operation there for generations, they found that they could no longer support that factory, and because that factory became uncompetitive. And so Fuyao faces the same sort of very, very unrelenting amount of pressure, as well as a very unforgiving economic environment. For Fuyao to survive and to justify their hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, they have to make that factory succeed. In other words, Fuyao's customers, such as General Motors, Honda, and Toyota, they all demand high-quality glass at a stipulated price. And if Fuyao cannot meet those price conditions, they're going to be out of business. I think what was portrayed in the movies, in this movie itself, was the fact when the union vote came up and 2/3 of the workers in the factory decided to reject the union, there's nobody that understands their local economic circumstance better than those workers. They understand very clearly, what's my next best alternative? Where am I going to go should I lose this job? And realizing that, and yes, that the wages that they were conditioned to receive from the former plant at General Motors was not going to be the same level of wages they would receive under Fuyao Glass. They made a very, very sort of reasoned sort of judgment in terms of what is my next best alternative. This is still the best thing going in town, and so therefore I've got to keep my job. And so it's the economic realities that the workers face, as well as the company faces, that all the participants in this movie are very well, attuned to.
Professor Dong, if I could continue, there's another interesting phenomenon reflected in the movie, which I think is quite representative about any foreign investors into a different country. American companies to China, Chinese companies to the United States too. For example, localization of the management. Now, the movie was portraying at the very beginning, an American was hired to be the manager of this Fuyao America. But eventually things didn't work out and he was somewhat fired. And an ethnic Chinese, a Chinese American, was being chosen in this case to be the CEO of Fuyao America. How do you see that? Of course, this is only one story. It's not representative of all the companies. But how do you see the challenges of localization, particularly in a very different culture, business, and also lifestyle as well?
Yeah, I would agree, Tian, that this is a movie that so beautifully portrays the sort of cultural conflicts and clashes, in a sense, a clash of civilizations, when Chinese companies try to operate in the United States. And certainly American companies operating in China have experienced the same thing. For many reasons, I suppose, behind the scenes, it's not fully explained to us as to why the American manager is the first to be appointed as a general manager of the factory. And then we later see him displaced, by a Chinese American who's bought in. Now, oftentimes there might be sort of issues of cultural similarity that are at play here, wherein Mr. Cao, who's the CEO, might feel more comfortable in dealing with somebody who is more akin or closer to his own culture. But what we see also is this. I think what we see is a very stark portrait and sort of differences between Chinese culture and American culture. Chinese culture being collectivist, and you could see that expressed when the American managers were flown to China to examine the Chinese factory, and American culture being much more individualistic. And so I think that's one of the sort of overall messages that this film portrays.
Ms. Janis, if you're still there with us.
Yes.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to, okay, go ahead, because
Yes.
I had a strong disagreement with the professor.
Go ahead.
Well, anybody who watches the movie would see that the workers who were supporting a union, which is a collectivist endeavor, were targeted, were fired, were threatened. And of course people voted no because they were scared to death. They were so scared to stand up for themselves. You know, I think this was an example of how workers in this country, in the United States, and in many parts of the world, are treated when they want to stand up and have just a decent job. We're not talking, you know, making $90,000 a year.
I see.
And I've seen Chinese companies who respect workers' rights to be in a union and who work quite well with workers and pay them a decent wage and still are competitive.
Well, we could tell, Ms. Janis, you're coming from the perspective of the union. Of course, whether workers' rights is best protected by a union factory or a factory that could at least operating and offer jobs to the people is, as I said, a beautiful debate going on in that film. Certainly, there's a lot being reflected. Having said that, though, Ms. Janis, I want to ask you about some of the quotes coming from Mr. and Mrs. Obama, the first couple, of course, former first couple, when they were in a way supporting this film to promote it around the world. Some of them were suggesting that some of the stories remind them of their childhood. They are, you know, they were being raised in some parts of America in which the family life was very much like that, and the fathers and the mothers are workers. So how do you see that the endorsement of the former first couple, in a way, for this movie to be spread around the world, and what kind of message is this sending, Ms. Janis?
Sure. I want to say that I am not coming from a union perspective or a non-union perspective. I'm coming from a human perspective.
Thank you. Well, what about this question I asked you? I hope we are not going to answer the same question over and over again, if you can.
I will. I'm happy to talk about the you know, president and former first lady, that they come from working class families, and especially Michelle Obama comes from a working class family in Chicago, where, you know, people have to go to work every day and try to, you know, support their families on, you know, modest income, and also raise their kids in a way that gives them, you know, hope for the future. And I think you see that throughout this film, that there are working class families, both Chinese and American, who are really trying to just live a good life and also treat, you know, raise their children in a way that breeds hope. And I think that's really appealing. This makes this film very appealing as just a wonderful story about people trying to make a better life for themselves and their families.
Right. Especially in the United States, Ms. Janis, if you think about the Rust Belt where Ohio is located, the dramatic change as a result of the industrialization and the upgrading of the industrialization for this part of your country. So what do you think? What kind of impact is it really having from your perspective? All the industrial changes and also digitalization, as well as the state of the U.S. economy for the local workers?
Well, I think that factory workers, for example, have been facing technological change for many, many years. And I think technology is a fact of life. And so how we adapt to technology and how workers adapt to technology depends on many things, including the willingness of employers to retrain people and to continue to create good jobs. And I think we're seeing, in many places, we're seeing a growth of industrial jobs. They're just changing in many ways the nature of those jobs. The big question for people like me and most Americans is, are these going to be good jobs? Are these jobs going to have create a future for those families and for the communities?
Right.
And I think we don't know the answer to that question, but hopefully it's yes.
It's certainly still a question mark. Professor Dong, go to you. Some of the scenes in the movie being portraying the American workers and the management went to the headquarters of the Chinese company Fuyao and were with them during the New Year gala, in a way. A lot of Chinese-style performances and even the wedding ceremony for many of those employees were being held in that gala. So the American management team, as well as the representative of the American workers, were quite impressed, and some even shed tears about how humans are really connected. Professor Dong, as a Chinese American, when you are watching that scene, I'm sure there's another layer of complexity of feelings over there.
Yes, that was a fascinating scene in which I think when they invited the American managers and workers to China, to the Fuyao factory, I think for some of these Americans it was the first time they ever set foot in China. And so it was sort of revelatory in terms of what they found was both inspiring as well as, they were able to sort of, in a sense, see the cultural differences starkly between China and America. What they saw was a company celebration at the Chinese New Year, wherein the company, again, engaged in a banquet for all of their employees. And then their employees and their families staged, entertainment for the entire assembled crowd, as well as, marriage ceremony performed on stage. But what the American managers came away with was that they were, in a sense, very, very much inspired by what they saw, and they were inspired by the sheer amount of efficiency of how well the factory itself was being run, and so as well as sort of the collective culture of Fuyao, wherein the employees sang company songs, dedicated themselves with slogans towards the success of the company, and this is something you would almost never see in an American factory.
Right. Of course, some of the American management are trying to take that back to America and try to implement that style, and it didn't work eventually. But it really just shows how complicated it is when we are on the learning curve to see the new change as a result of the globalization and industrialization. Having said that, though, Professor Dong, I want to follow up. We were trying very hard over the past few days, try to reach both the producers, directors, as well as assistant producers of this film. And we failed to have any one of them agree to come to this program or to be on our network. However, we all understand that this movie, this factory itself, has granted the crew almost no, in a way, almost every access to what's going on within the company, whether it's in a meeting room or it is a private conversation between two employees, or the management of the Chinese Fuyao, how they reflect upon their experiences in America. So I'm not trying to make any conclusion. I'm just saying it seems that things are getting ever more complicated, and it's getting ever more politically sensitive in a way. How do you see that, Professor Dong, even reflected in the movie itself?
Well, the film itself and the access that the Fuyao had granted to the filmmakers, to me, was nothing short of remarkable. They gave them a tremendous amount of access, and in a very sort of uncontrolled manner, allowed even the conversations of their Chinese managers to be recorded. And some of those conversations were not exactly, I would say, complimentary, in terms of how they had spoken about some of the activities that they had been observing on the American factory floor. I mean, it's funny because Fuyao's glasses, we are transparent. And of course, that carried through in this movie, and I was just stunned because it's very rare for a Chinese company, or an American company for that matter, to give a filmmaker that kind of unfettered access to the factory floor, and thus, in my opinion, resulting in a much better and finer piece of filmmaking.
And Ms. Janis, if you're still there, I also want to follow up with you about an important question. That is, you know, with how much of an open mind that we need to be today, when there are a lot of changes going on, and there are a lot of things that we are not familiar with or we are not used to, and that could become a fact of life. From your perspective, whether it's workers or factories, companies, or people to people, even country to country, how do you understand that?
Well, I think, you know, open mind goes multiple ways. You know, on one hand, one of the reasons I wrote an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times is because there are now many assumptions about Chinese people being, you know, not caring about workers, not caring about communities, not being willing to be a partner in communities, and I have seen that to not be true. On the other hand, there are Chinese stereotypes about Americans that are shown in the film, and I think when you talked about American workers not supporting their companies, I think that's a stereotype. I think that most American workers strongly support their companies. They also want their companies to treat them fairly, and so I think that, you know, those are not contradictory. So I think we all have a lot to learn from this film about how we see each other and how we see our common humanity, and how stereotypes are really the opposite of what we need to be doing. We need to be open-minded, as you said, and we need to be willing to think about what it takes for people to have good lives and for communities to have success.
Thank you so much. Madeline Janis and Arthur Dong, helping us to understand your perspective about this fascinating film, documentary film called American Factory. It is not just a film, it's actually with this film and through this film what we can learn about each other. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.